Hello, fourth grade science friends, and welcome back to more ways that the Earth's surface can be changed. Today we're going to focus on ways that ice changes the land. Hopefully you've read the text on your own, but we're going to go over it together anyway. What can move rocks that are as big as houses or as small as silt or sand? Ice. So I'm going to stop right there for a second. In one of our previous lessons, we saw pictures of boulders in a field. And in that lesson, it told us that ice put those boulders there. So I've been really waiting for this lesson and excited to find out how exactly does ice put boulders in a field. So when it says what can move rocks that are as big as houses or small as silt or sand, ice, we're going to talk about what actually put those big boulders in that field. A glacier is a huge area of slow-moving ice. In some places, massive glaciers changed Earth's surface as they slowly moved over the land. As glaciers moved, they scraped against rock, carving it into new shapes. Okay, so first of all, that is definitely one way a glacier can change the land. It can, as it moves and it bumps up against rock, large rock, mountainous rock, as it kind of moves through that land, it can chip away pieces of the rock, creating some of the landforms that we see on Earth today. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But I also want you to think back to that lesson. And I'll actually kind of flip back to that page right now real quick because I think it's important that we see it. I think it's weird to think that glaciers put these here. So basically, let me kind of explain to you how the glaciers put these big boulders in the middle of this field. As the glaciers are slowly moving across the Earth's surface, just like water, they can pick up rocks. Now, water's of course only going to pick up little pieces of sediment or small rocks, whereas glaciers can pick up giant boulders because glaciers are really, really big. Okay, because let's face it, little pieces of ice are not going to change the Earth's surface in terms of moving large boulders. You're going to need huge pieces of ice to do this, and that's where glaciers come in. So glaciers are humongous, way bigger than these boulders. Okay, so when you think about that, as these glaciers were moving across the land, and remember, glaciers can be found in really cold areas. They would pick up boulders, okay? And whether these boulders were chipped off of larger pieces of rock and kind of traveled with the glacier, or whether the glaciers moved over them and just sort of pulled the rock with them, that's how they moved. Now, why did they settle here in this area right here? Well, glaciers eventually melt, okay? Glaciers come from cold areas, so as they move, they melt. And when they melt, they will deposit these large boulders in new places, okay? So that's one thing that's important to know, is that glaciers can be responsible for both weathering, erosion, and deposition. When they bump up against large rocks and scrape pieces off, or they move over rock and smooth it out, that is going to be your weathering. When the glacier picks up the pieces of large rocks and takes it with it, that's going to be your erosion. And when the glacier eventually melts and deposits those boulders, like in the field we just saw, that's going to be your deposition, okay? Ice can change Earth's surfaces in another way too. Water seeps into cracks in rock. The water freezes and expands. The ice inside the cracks acts like a wedge. It makes the cracks wider. The repeated freezing and thawing of ice will eventually widen the cracks so much that the rocks split apart. So what I want you to imagine is, I want you to imagine the difference between day and night. So you might be in a place where it's pretty cold, but during the day the sun comes out and it's just enough to melt some ice, okay? So as this ice melts, it becomes water. And even though sometimes we can't see it, rocks have cracks in them. Especially rocks as big as the ones that you see in the background of this page right here, okay? So when when the ice melts and becomes water, it can seep into the cracks inside of any of these rocks, okay? Any of these rocks that you see here. As the sun goes down, it gets colder, the water's going to freeze again. And as water freezes, as it says right here, it expands, which means it gets bigger, okay? If you've ever noticed when you've frozen water in a water bottle, it actually kind of pushes against the bottle and takes up a little more space in the bottle than it did when it was just water, okay? So as this ice, or as this water freezes and it becomes ice, when it's in the cracks of the rock, it actually kind of pushes against the rock and actually opens whatever little cracks into larger pieces, okay? The cracks become larger. Eventually over time, and we're not talking about 2 days here, this is going to take, hundreds, thousands of years for this to all happen. As that happens, little by little, every time it melts and freezes, it's going to make those cracks wider to the point where eventually the crack would be so wide, the rock will split apart. Okay, so this would be an example of how ice can weather rocks. Okay, this is an example of weathering. Now there's lots of pictures on this page, so we're going to check out each one. First, we're going to focus on the picture in the background right here. So I'm going to click this. It says glaciers carved steep cliffs in Yosemite Valley. Okay, so we're going to kind of talk about that in a second, how that happened. Okay, so let's go to this picture right here. It says glaciers carved wide U-shaped valleys in Yosemite National Park in California. So you can kind of see how they've drawn this diagram to show you the U shape. Okay, so basically at one point this was a more even surface, but as the glaciers kind of moved through this valley here, through the national park, it created this U-shaped valley. And how it did that is the glacier would slowly slide through here, slowly move over the land, and chip away pieces of rock on this side and this side until it happened to look like the shape we see today. Okay, so again, that's the weathering of the glacier, bumping up against the sides and knocking off pieces of rock, sometimes small pieces of sediment, sometimes large pieces of the rock. Okay, the other picture here is going to sound really interesting and a little bit hard to understand, but this is called a hanging valley. Okay, it's hanging because it's a valley, but it's up higher. Okay, it says this hanging valley formed when a small shallow glacier flowed into a larger glacier. Okay, so basically there was a small glacier kind of up here moving across the land and changing the Earth's surface, and it flowed into a larger glacier that was maybe moving by. Okay, and then the last thing we want to look at here today is this picture here, which shows a tree growing out of a rock, because like this whole entire thing, guys, I don't know if you realize this, is a rock. It says long ago, a glacier scraped this rock smooth. So this may have been a nice rough rock, one of those like jagged edges and things. But over time, as a glacier would move over the surface and take pieces of rock and scrape against it, it scraped it so that it was smoother. Okay, and this kind of takes us into something that's going to be coming in the future. This tree is a living thing, and I have to imagine that this is changing the Earth's surface in some way, which is what our next lesson is going to discuss. Okay, so a couple important things to remember is that glaciers are made of ice, and they're very large, and they move slowly over the land, and they are one way that ice can cause the land to change. First, it can scrape against large rocks as it slowly moves across the land and break pieces of the rock off to make shapes like you see here from Yosemite Valley National Park. Another way that a glacier can affect is actually to do, besides this weathering that we just mentioned, as it breaks the rocks off, they can be big boulders. The glacier can actually carry the rocks with it and then deposit it in a new place. So that would be your erosion and deposition. When the glacier carries the rocks, it's erosion. And when the glacier melts and leaves the rocks in a new place, the boulders in a new place, that would be your deposition. Okay? Another way that ice can change the Earth's surface by weathering is when the water gets into the cracks of the rock and then it freezes. And every time it freezes, it expands or gets a little bit bigger, and it cracks the rocks a little wider, eventually causing them to split apart. Okay, so those are the important things you need to know for the lesson. Good luck on your fill in the blanks and time to climb, and your wrap it up questions at the end. Okay, good luck everybody, and I'll see you again for the next lesson.